You're listening to Mystic Lounge with Alan B. Smith. Rebroadcast on the Onyx Network. Thursdays at 11 p.m. Pacific. Fridays at 2 a.m. Eastern.
However you are and whenever you are, welcome to Mystic Lounge. I'm Alan B. Smith. Joining me tonight is psychotherapist and author of Life After Breath, Jacob L. Cooper. We'll be discussing his work in what is called past life memory recovery, overcoming emotional barriers, spiritual growth, improved resiliency, and more. So this will be a really fun night. I think you're going to enjoy the ride through, psychotherapeutic veil breaking philosophy. So hang in there for just a little bit. If I can send you a friendly reminder, please subscribe on YouTube. That's youtube.com/Mystic Lounge. And on social media, you can find me on Instagram at Paranormal Now or on Twitter at Paranormal_Now. And if you are a fan of this show as well as the the Coffee and UFOs podcast, please click the notification bell, comment down below on the YouTube channel, like as much as you can, and please share because those organic shares really help the channel to grow. And of course, if you listen to the podcast on iTunes or wherever else, any kind of review and rating you could leave is much appreciated. All right, my guest, Jacob Cooper, based his near-death experience and past life regressions and his insight about the mystery of life on the other side of the veil. In addition to peace and euphoria in the afterlife, we also experience these feelings in the physical world. Jacob says there's so much more to live for, as we are much more resilient than we imagine. Jacob's experience provides the guidance for others to experience past life memories by assisting in the development of self-awareness and finding meaning in their experiences. Jacob holds a Master of Social Work degree and is a licensed clinical social worker, certified Reiki master, certified hypnotherapist, and specializes in past life regression therapy. His website is jacoblcooper.com. Jacob, welcome to Mystic Lounge. How are you?
Thank you, Alan. A real honor to be here with you this evening.
I appreciate it. Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about your NDE?
Yeah, I had my NDE when I was, like, as I said, 3 years old.
Mhm.
Get my age away, this is September of 1993, and I went to, like, a park or a playground, and I was just, playing in the park, but at the time, I didn't know this. I had something called pertussis, otherwise known as whooping cough, and so for those not familiar with whooping cough, for infants or kids or adults, it could be fatal and lead to suffocation due to the cough. And for myself, I went to the park and due to whooping cough, I was climbing a ladder, going onto a slide, and when I was at the top, I just began totally suffocating, where there was literally nothing to hold on to, nothing to pull. I was just put in this torment of torture where wasn't able to breathe, and my body just, wasn't functioning due to the deprivation of oxygen. And so, um, after losing all parts of my physical breath, I let go of suffering. I let go of the turmoil and torture that I was in, and I surrendered to the breath of eternity, which is, the part of us that goes beyond the breath of the body. That's the center of who we are and where we're created from. And, once I let go of my body and my suffering, I was able to really enter the other side and the other realms. And I had awareness that was profound, of a lot of classic NDE experiences, minus my age. But, I was really aware of my spirit guides. I became aware of my soul family members, previous lifetimes that I've lived,
Mhm.
what I would be doing in this lifetime, and just awareness of, the highest vibration, you know, in the universe, which to me would be God itself. But that's a very limiting word. And so it was incredibly profound. But I do want to preface. I know you mentioned, we're having a lot of people who are trying to prove science and metaphysics. And what I'll say is, when I was having this experience, my brain, due to the deprivation of oxygen, wasn't able to function. Once I felt my brain deprived of oxygen, I felt a large snap in half in my brain. And once literally my brain cracked in half, that's when everything, popped in, as the saying goes. And so this really puts, the brain and mind, question into fruition where, if your brain is at a very limited basis, why should you have, where is this mind? Where does this come from? If the brain creates consciousness. So
Mm.
someone like myself who had, a TBI and my body just suffocated, I had a lot more awareness than I do right now when I'm fully healthy and breathing. So, where does this all emanate from? To this day, the medical community and science community cannot answer that.
What do you mean more awareness?
Well, awareness beyond this realm, awareness, that goes beyond just, what we're aware of. In this, most of us are just aware of our thoughts and our prior experiences. For me, this opened me up to a place that was familiar, that was buried deep within, but it was an incredibly deep yet familiar place on the other side that I was, a part of.
And how old were you?
Physically, I was 3 years old.
3 years
Which,
old.
yeah,
Wow.
yeah, yeah.
And so you remember this. Now, it's not impossible. I mean, I know there are, people who can remember it up to like 4, sometimes 3.
No,
Right?
it's certainly not impossible.
Yeah.
There's a book, written by PMH Atwater, about, and she is a near-death experiencer. She specializes in infant and children near-death experiencers. So I
Mm,
suggest, readers to pick that her book up. I think it's called Little Angel, Forever Angels. I have it
mm,
behind me. I'm not trying to promote, but near-death experience
yeah.
research, highlights infants and children who are able to remember the near-death experiences. Certainly, kids have a lot of deals of recollection, not only um, of their current life, but previous lives. So if it's possible to remember something from 20, 30 years ago, if it's possible to remember things from hundreds of thousands of years ago, I would certainly think it's possible to remember something from, a couple of decades ago in this life too.
Yes, yes. But I mean, there is kind of because of the way the brain develops when you're that young, there are certain limitations. Eh, but outside of the near-death experience memory, do you have any other really early memories that have stuck with you?
Most of my memories that I have as a kid are related to the NDE when I was an infant. So that's the strongest memory that I had. But I
That's
do
interesting.
remember
Okay.
experiences that go beyond this, my mind. For instance,
Mhm.
after my NDE, I had a lot of experiences where I was a lot more comfortable on the other side than on this side. So I have a lot of memories going into the higher realms as a young infant. In fact, I chronicle that in my first book. So, I think in a way the brain is just a filter of life. It's not the producer. And so when I had all these experiences, it goes well beyond the brain. And I think that's why I'm able to remember it. It goes well beyond the linear mind. And so for me, that's why I do believe I'm able to retain it. But the strongest reason is one of the strongest reason is the gift of trauma. This was the most traumatic experience. I wouldn't wish it on anyone to suffocate, in their lives. So the intense feeling of suffocation that I had and the trauma that it created in my life is the gift that I was able to get, which was memory. And I think with trauma, you could easily push it away to protect yourself, or it's really deep, ingrained in you, and sticks. So for me, I was the other way around when I suffocated.
Mm.
You
And this happened just once, one near-death experience?
know? One was enough, but it's funny. A lot
Yeah,
of
I
people.
shouldn't say
Yeah.
just, but
No,
yeah.
no, no, no,
Yeah,
no. I'll preface that.
yeah.
Uh, when I go to conferences, for like a place called like IANS, like
Mhm.
International Association of Near-Death Studies, people will come up to me and be like, "So you only had one near-death experience?" I mean, these people are like cats. They had like 7 or 8 or 9 of these. I'm just like, all right, I'm not gonna say yes or say no, but
Hmm.
it was a profound near-death experience. I've had out-of-body experiences later in life, which to me gives me more weight because I'm my own biggest skeptic of my NDE. Know?
Yeah.
I,
Do you,
I, I'm a big skeptic of life itself. So for me to do this publicly, it had to be, grounded in truth,
yeah. Do you find that people who have had near death experiences are more prone to out of body experiences?
It's a possibility. I can't have quantifiable data to represent that, but
Hmm.
I think I find I've like most of my colleagues who had NDEs, I see a lot of them as healers or evidential mediums or intuitives.
Hmm.
So I think near-death experience can undeniably enhance your own, superpowers within and accelerate those to come to the surface. But to me, it really is about getting in touch with who you are at a deep level, and who you are is a deeply wise, intuitive, soul. And sometimes people hold on to that, and sometimes people push that away, or life can push that away, in this world. So I just think it's more recollection of who you are and what we're connected to, and holding on to that memory. Memory is profound. It could be profound in our lives for good things too.
So there's this idea in past life regression where by unlocking a past life trauma, you can heal one's psychological state. Now, however, there's also very real world therapies that
Mm.
work
Oh,
without
sure.
having to do past life regression. So as a
Yeah.
psychotherapist, how do you, I don't know, how do you not reconcile, but how do you separate those two things? How do you delineate? How do you know when, aha, I should treat this, with more of like a traditional therapy approach, or we need to do a past life regression.
Right. I mean, it's hard because I have my hands tied with what I do as a therapist, and still to this day, it's not, I think mindfulness is accepted and integrated in traditional therapy, right? But
Hmm.
past life regression still, and you would think with Dr. Brian Weiss coming out, a Yale trained psychiatrist and stuff like that, that it would be respected. But no, traditional hypnosis is, but not necessarily past life regression.
Hmm.
But to answer your question specifically, I would say, kind of like a train, right? We have different stops in the train, and when if whatever we're working on isn't working or not explained within this lifetime, I wouldn't say necessarily would jump to past life regression, but I'd first do, hypnosis and see maybe if we could take the client back to an age regression, which is just going back to the possibility of that point of origin, earlier in their lives, or at a time where maybe they don't remember it and it's buried deep within their subconscious. So I, in therapy, right, when people come to me and let's say the stomach issue, I'd say, all right, go to your doctor, rule out medical before we label this as a somatic kind of thing. So yeah, with people who come to me, we first really want to explore all avenues before we jump to the conclusion that, that it's something subconscious or something buried deep within, you know.
Hmm. So do we take trauma from previous lives with us?
I think we all do. I think being born is a trauma, right? It's for many, it's hard
True.
to leave that spirit realm and to come here. That's, and we're
Mhm.
crying, hysterically, and it's just funny about life how we come in the world crying, and when we leave, the world cries because we're not physically here. For hopefully for the most of us, it's full circle moment. But I think a lot of people do carry traumas, but they also carry gifts too, and strengths, and so. But there's lessons at the larger sense too. That people, the biggest question is what's my soul's purpose? Why am I here?
Mhm.
And at times, past life regression could lead to people being their own detectives of their lives to kind of come through, certain clues or tendencies as to why we are here. You know,
Mhm.
it's not the totality or definite of it, but for many, it does help them to have some meaning and purpose, into this life, and to take away the randomness of things.
There is something about that, because for whatever reason, people can be, raised similarly, raised by the same parents, and you can see these shared, general attributes.
Mm.
But there's something about personality traits that begin to show very early
Right.
in before those 6 years are
Mm.
up, right? Like those formative 6 years where they say that you really shape,
Mm.
the subconscious sort of behavioral structure of a child. We already see that there's an individuation there. There's something special about each child. So is that a manifestation of genetics, or is that a soul kind of infusing this physical body with some
Right.
a personality?
Yeah, the nature nurture stuff. I mean, I think it could certainly be both. I mean, certainly, we are influenced through environmental forces and cultural influences. Undeniably, that does influence us. But I think beyond that, each and every one of us has a unique soul. I do believe we're all one. That doesn't mean that we're all the same, and I think everyone is, unique.
Hmm.
But back to kids though, and children. I mean, from having my near-death experience, I could tell you that kids and infants aren't what we think they are. Many times we kind of look at them as congruent with their bodies or how they portray themselves to
Hmm.
us, but beyond that, is a timeless soul, and it takes time for that soul to integrate itself into this instrument or this body, to learn how to express itself, to learn how to adapt, to learn how to adjust to everything. But you know I can't say that a kid is just a kid, I
Yeah.
think the soul is experiencing itself, as an infant or as a kid or as a name and all this kind of egoic construct. But beyond the personality is a timeless, soul is what I experience in my NDE, that we have these names and ages and stuff like that, but those are all temporary experiences. There's a larger part of us beyond this experience, I believe.
Yeah. Is the science out on this yet? So are humans born inherently good, meaning, the whole Lord of the Flies,
Mm,
concept where, like, we need to be taught, we need to be shown how to behave and what's good and what's right and what's bad and what's wrong, or do we actually come out organically with an inherent goodness, and we're just corrupted along the way?
yeah.
Because I remember being a boy. I mean, we could be, pretty rough and sometimes mean.
Mhm.
Um, and so, where did that come from? Is that just because we have testosterone, or is that because we learned it somewhere?
Yeah, I think deep within almost anyone, there's that seed of goodness, and at times that's lost in the world or influenced. I think there's a lot of factors. I mean, you said it best, where there's a lot of hormonal stuff happening at that age and transitions and stuff like that that could lead to impulsivity or irritability. I mean, you're
Hmm.
also talking about the brain too, which up until the mid or to late 20s is really underdeveloped in the frontal lobe. And so there's the soul, but there's also the body, and they're not always in sync.
Hmm.
Hopefully within a time they can be. But I mean, my question is that I always have is someone inherently bad, or are they fulfilling their duty here on this world?
Ooh.
And that's something that I struggle with, because I
Yeah.
think the people that we look at as history as the worst, like people, yes, in that time, what they did is horrible and almost irreparable. But you look at it through, a broader lens when we're on that realm, we recognize that from that time or that period, there was tremendous transformation and healing. And so, you know, is actors that we have just seen as good, or some of them are these bad actors that could also lead to accelerated change for humanity? To this day, I don't have an answer for that. I don't know.
That's
That's a hard one.
that's complicated. Yeah.
It
Because
is, yeah.
there's certain public figures that you know,
Right.
you can loathe, but then the reactions to them instigated something positive. It's not unlike the women's liberation movement, or the Vietnam War protests, and the movement toward of the hippie generation. I mean, mind consciousness expansion really kicked off. I mean, it's sure it started with
Right.
the beatniks, but it really kicked off with that generation, and that was out of a resistance to what you might consider evil, or
Right.
a
Right.
negative force, right?
Right.
So
I can't.
so
It's hard.
so you're saying Jeffrey Dahmer has a purpose on this planet, or
Well, you know,
I don't know about that.
hard.
That's a tough one.
I can't speak on specifics out of sensitivities to families involving
Sure,
people.
sure.
So to get into specifics, but you know, yeah, I mean, sometimes this world is like a slingshot where we have these like terribly tumultuous period and we take a step back. But from those periods, whether on a micro or macro basis,
Yeah.
there's growth. And so some people shake things up, in a
Mhm.
horrible way, but afterwards there's tremendous change. And a near death experience I look at as the most horrible moment of my life when I suffocated. But after that deprivation of life and that trauma was tremendous, healing. And
Mhm.
I think that's allegorical or symmetrical for so many people on the healing journey, where you don't have to have this, but you could also find it in all things, even the darkest, of things. So I don't think light just exists within light itself. It could be found, within the darkest moments, especially too, you know, and it could be transformed from those periods.
Yeah, I think that most people can relate that to a degree, for sure. Um, so that leads us to what do we do if we recognize there is some psychological issue that we need to overcome? Where do you start when you're working with someone?
Oh, with my patients,
Hmm.
yeah. Mm. Well, particularly, my job is really to be a Buddhist monk. And why I say that is, much like a Buddhist monk, you enter the world with compassion, with empathy,
Hmm.
with understanding, with mindfulness, with presence. And so my job as a therapist is really to enter people's worlds, with those same tenets. I think that's significant. But when people are trying to change their lives, it depends where they are in the change process. I mean, resistance is a part of it, the change process, and some people are ready to go. Um, I think the issue comes in the way society is today. On one hand, we see everywhere that mental health is broadcasted, everywhere, and it's very known and accessible.
Hmm.
But on the other hand, the society that we live on, that's very trendy and just focuses on the next thing, is incongruent with mental health. Because mental health work is a process. It's not something that we just run away from or just try to move away from.
Hmm.
We have to actually feel with it, go with it, acknowledge it, not just cancel it and move on to the next thing. And so I think that's the biggest hurdle, is people just want to get healed right here, right now, and they're
Yeah, yeah.
jumping to these coaches and this and so there's like a sense of urgency, in life, and people don't and not to blame them, but society, in the way that we're wired, puts a difficult position at times in the change process and allowing things to unfold in their own time. Yeah.
There are a lot of problems all of us have to deal with
Mm,
within ourselves. So I think that a lot of people, they give up because it's too much. So it's
mm,
not like, if I had just one issue,
mm,
I could just focus on that and work on that, that would be fine. I think that people are overwhelmed, because we can often be very self-critical, of ourselves, and sometimes too much.
mm,
And so you start working on this one thing. I'm going to change this about myself, and then this other thing keeps cropping up, and then another thing crops up, and you're like,
mm,
I can't. there's just too much. It's
Mhm.
so hard to change. So, what do you say to people who feel overwhelmed?
I think first of all, they want to be heard. Right? I think simply just allowing people to be heard. One time I had a session with a client and I literally didn't say a word. And she said, "That's the best session I've ever had." I'm like, and so in my head, I'm like, all right, less Jacob is better,
Yeah.
right? But I think a lot of people want to be heard. But
Hmm.
I think when you're able to look at mental health, in a similar, fashion than physical health, you're good. So for instance, like let's say you need to go to a hospital, you have all these medical stuff, going on. But if you're able to compartmentalize and triage what's happening, you could start from there. So I think, for people, if they're like combining everything at once, it's going to lead to barriers. But I think if you're able to focus on the most, pressing, of issues,
Hmm.
particularly with my patients, a lot of it is harm reduction, safety. That's usually the place to kind of start in terms of like the most immediate needs, and then working your way down the ladder, no pun intended, with
Hmm.
my book. But but I think triaging, yeah, triaging things is great, and that leads to for people to kind of become less overwhelmed. But I think really identifying and getting people to kind of have an understanding the most pressing presenting problem,
Hmm.
or issue, is significant, and they're able to take ownership of it instead of being paralyzed by it.
Yeah, paralyzed. That's a good word, right?
Yeah,
It's beyond just being discouraged. It's like, oh, I just can't do this anymore.
for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So is there a way to do this on one's own, or do you think it's always better to have someone to talk to?
I mean, I think everyone's different, but it certainly couldn't. Well, it can hurt. It can hurt if you're with the wrong person who's not the
Mm,
right fit, and they just, and just because you're whatever does not mean, you're a fit for anyone, or, you're
yeah.
worthy of practicing. I think everyone has to really use their own intuition when picking a therapist. Not every therapist is right for every client,
Hmm.
and certainly with a client's own degree of countertransference and all that stuff, there's a lot of subconscious stuff that could be interfering that has nothing to do with the therapist, but a lot to do with your prior experiences. So I think having a fit is significant because there's no change that happens if you don't build that relationship. The relationship building is first. But I think, beyond that is for people to have an identity beyond, but including pathology. I think with life sometimes we could have an identity of pathology,
Hmm.
and that could really lead people to really seeing themselves as a deficit sometimes and not as a strength. And so I think with people when they come to me, I want to make this clear that that they're explaining all these difficulties, and they're kind of like um, being down on themselves.
Hmm.
And I try to have a Buddhist kind of thing, which is called cognitive reframing, where you're seeing things one way that's very degrading, but then you could just change it just a little bit. And you see a totally
Hmm.
different reality. And I say, wow, you are an incredibly resilient person to be able to live with all this. You have a lot of strength in you to live day to day. And I just don't know what that's like for you. So, so at times it gives a person a sense of confidence that and strength that, not so much, what's going against them, but what they have within to deal with all these things, day to day.
Offhand, can you think of an example of cognitive reframing?
Cognitive reframing. I mean,
Hmm.
at the simplest way, like I could say, all right, this happened to me in my own personal life. It wasn't to me, but someone was texting me. I wasn't around. I was with a patient.
Hmm.
They flipped out on me thinking, "Oh my God, this guy doesn't like me. This guy, doesn't care about me." But meanwhile, I was with the patient. It wasn't personal.
Hmm.
So when we've all been in those situations where we want to get in touch with someone and they're doing something, and our mind jumps to, "Oh my God, they don't like me. I'm not good enough. They must not think anything of me." And so a cognitive reframe would be, yeah, maybe Jacob's busy. Maybe Jacob has a client. Maybe Jacob's doing something. It's not always woe is me and this is personal.
Hmm.
So that something like that where we're seeing things in a very in a way that's leading to a lot of distress, and we're changing how we look at things too, in a situation. So that's more of an externalized, but that's just like an example of changing our lens to a situation. It's all rooted within CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy work, which is understand the influences in our thoughts that leads to our feelings, which shape our emotions, which shape our behaviors.
Hmm. Now, when we're younger, particularly in our 20s, you could say that there is more, active neural plasticity, because the brain is still kind of somewhat in that developmental stage,
Mm,
and it just there's a different youthful mentality when you're young, and then when you're older, it becomes, I think, a little bit more difficult to kind
mm,
of reignite that neuroplasticity,
mm,
but you also have wisdom and reflection, and you can, that you don't have when you're younger. So, of these two general groups, is it any more difficult for one or the other to really make, you know, significant changes in how they see themselves or how they see the world, or behavioral changes and that sort of thing? Or just, overcoming trauma. I mean, is it easier when you're
yeah.
younger, or is it better when you're older?
Mm. At every age, it comes with its own unique difficulties, but I wouldn't be going into work if I didn't feel that change was possible. And I see clients from anywhere from 6 years old to clients in their 70s and 80s, and I think at any point in time we could change. And certainly, Harvard has supported, mindfulness and meditation as a way to kind of rewire, that neuroplasticity and with all the gray matter in the brain into, all that kind of stuff. So I think it's possible with awareness, with compassion, with looking inward. I think anyone can change. I think what's the
Mm.
point of living today if we can't have a possibility of having a better day than a better self than yesterday? I think anyone can.
Well,
Uh,
they have the expression, you can't teach an old dog
and
new
old
new
dog nature.
tricks,
Yeah, yeah,
but you can. But that expression comes from some truth, right? I mean,
right.
those kind of, uh, overgeneralizations. But it does come from some kind of a truth.
Right. I
So,
think it's more temperament, which is like, that goes beyond change. That's just kind of like a fixed part of people,
mhm,
that I think to some degree is is almost unchangeable. So some, you know, people there's just parts of themselves that they have to learn how to embrace, but that's a part of the change process. I think people could struggle about the parts of themselves that they don't like,
mhm,
but I think it's learning how to live with that, learning how to appreciate that, learning how to engage with that, learning how to monitor those things to a degree. But some things, within us are just a part of our personality, and it's kind of learning how to live with that in a high gear, you know.
in a high gear.
Well, in the high, like, but I'm using kind of clinical terms, but what I would say is learning, how to live with that as something that's not a detriment, as something that could, that we could, live with in the best way.
Mm. So, if I come to you and I start doing some work,
Mm.
um, and I do want to access past life memories, uh, how do you go about that process?
Oh, sure. I mean, I actually just saw a client today for a regression, but first of all, we do like a little bit of an intake with my clients just to kind of see
Hmm.
why do they want to go to that down that road? What's exactly happening? Some people there's like real concrete psychological reasons. Others it's more so for curiosity.
Hmm.
You know, so it depends. But then also, really kind of understanding like if it is psychological, what might be going on? What are they hitting regarding the wall and stuff like that? What are they experiencing? What are their kind of inklings about things?
Hmm.
Any dreams that they might have had, about, other lifetimes or cultures that might kind of really speak to them or parts of the world, and just getting like a more of a basic picture of a person. The actual process itself is just a form of hypnotherapy, which really, basically we have the conscious mind as we know, but then we have the subconscious mind, which goes beyond what we're aware of at this moment, and kind of view it like a database where, you know, every thought, deed, memory that we could ever have is stored within that. And if you believe that we go beyond this lifetime, you're tapping into that, storehouse of memories that go beyond just this lifetime. And so, my clients, we do something called a hypnotic induction, which really allows them to get into more of that receptive place of touching the subconscious mind,
Hmm.
letting go of, some of the barriers to it and really accessing higher awareness, and then we really kind of guide them through suggestibility. Like hypnosis is not a mind control thing like it's portrayed in Hollywood. It's really about the power of suggestibility and people having a lot more choice and freedom, to really go where they want to go on a higher level. And then we go to the earlier stages in life and then beyond that. You know.
Do you see people of a particular ethnicity or race when they have these regressions?
Mm.
Do they see mostly past lives of themselves in that same race, or do you see variation?
Not usually. And people get surprised because we're so, a part of us experiencing this in this lifetime with our races and cultures is just so embedded in so many of us and how we perceive ourselves. So
Hmm.
in religion too, but no. At times, like I've seen it, but mostly it's like people come out of there confused, like, wow, I wasn't even my own gender. I was the opposite gender, or,
Hmm.
I was in another part of the world. But at the same time, I do get people that say, oh, that makes sense, because there's just a part of them that might resonate. I personally think that we incarnate into different cultures for many reasons, but
Hmm.
but but for to me, it's to have an understanding and to make us more of these universal beings that's able to understand all walks of life and cultures and civilization,
Hmm.
and to let go of just having this unidimensional, way of unidimensional cultural identity, and to make us more of these universal citizens that could relate to anyone or anything. It's expansive in a way. Um, you know.
Yeah, I ask because sometimes on television, it seems to be a skewed representation. Typically, someone's past life that
Mm.
they're sharing about on screen is, it's I was Europe, I'm white, and
Right.
past life was in Europe, with the rare exception of I was Nefertiti.
Right.
And
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, yeah. You do see that sometimes where it's like, sometimes it does, but I would say more times than not, from my own experience, right?
Hmm.
I see people who just come out kind of confused, or like that has nothing to do with who I am
Right.
right now. That's a totally different kind of thing. So at
Yeah, I think I
times,
think
sure, yeah,
I think it's important to address because that's something that skeptics would look at, right?
right,
Because it's like, okay, of all these billions of souls, what did your, how varied was your past life, and wouldn't it
right.
make sense that it was varied? And that's what you're saying, that it is, and there's a reason for it being varied. So if there's a reason for it being varied, does that mean there's a reason for the near death experience in and of itself? Because without the experience, you wouldn't have the peering,
Mm.
um the information from the other side of the veil to feed that idea that we're all kind of one soul.
Right. It's a great point, but I think in a way, if the universe or God wouldn't want this stuff to be known, you wouldn't have near-death experiences. I think this is God's green light to, or the universe's green light to give permission for us to remember that part of ourselves. And so sometimes we really hyper focus near-death experiencers with the near-death experience itself. I think,
Hmm.
you know, small me had this near-death experience, but it wasn't about me. It was about telling others and having a way to process this so that others could really benefit from it. That's to me the purpose of it. I don't think life is solely just about us. There's the individual and then the collective, and they're integrated. But
Hmm.
I think near death experience goes beyond you, where, especially at this time, now that, in most cultures, we're not going to be, ostracized, at least where I'm living.
Hmm.
Plenty of other countries, I'm sure they might have a different experience, but at times it's a lot more receptive now more than ever. Uh, but I think if it wasn't supposed to happen, it wouldn't, but I think it's there for a reason, much like anything else, and it's so profound. But, with near death experiences, I mean, there's people who, live in all parts of the world, and their experiences have nothing to do with, usually with what they experience in terms of
Hmm.
the religious, their prior religious or spiritual orientations of life and the afterlife. And when they cross over, it has nothing to do usually with what they experience. And if it does, to me, it's not as an authentic as an NDE. I don't think you really cross over if your mind isn't blown to a degree. You
Yeah.
know.
What is the most kind of uh, exciting or astounding past life experience that you've uh, heard from a patient?
From a patient,
Hmm.
nothing to like break, the media like we see with these, people who remember their exact names and are able to go back to the town records. But I think for me, it's what I'll say is everyone thinks they're Cleopatra, but there's 6 or 7 of them, so there can only, and I asked like, which one were you? Most people just want to be Cleopatra in every
Yeah.
lifetime.
Hmm.
But I got to be honest, like, throughout my experience, they're not like, no one was like Pharaoh or anything like that. They just
Hmm.
had these remembrances of other lifetimes, throughout different parts of the globe. I think the one thing that really blew me away, and this happened like in 2 or 3 occasions, I had some like people who weren't into this stuff. They had like memories of themselves in other lifetimes. So I'm like going to the Earth plane, and they're like describing stuff on other planes, like, and that
Ah.
was interesting. And I've never seen that prior to these people. Like normally we do the regression, you're getting people to go back to, these lives on Earth, but they were just
Hmm.
kind of like talking about like themselves as like UFO, I guess the word is UFOs and stuff like that, and just on other planets in what they live with. And some of them were also able to go into the life in between lives and describe their life on the other side a little bit too. Like, Dr.
Mm.
Michael Newton, in The Journey of Souls talks a little bit about that. So I've seen that, but like nothing like where people are able to go in the town records and evidentially remember their name, stuff like that. Although I've had colleagues who have been able to do that, and it's profound. So, you know.
What does the what does that in other world look like? Is it a parallel Earth world that you're talking about, like another plane of
No, no, it
another?
was it was
Oh,
like another planet. So they were talking about their lives in other existences. So I guess they were like a Lemurian or, something like that, just like a higher ascended beings living on
mm.
that. So, I'm not here to debunk or just validate, I can only
Yeah,
take
yeah,
the
yeah.
information. And I think my job is more so for the person themselves to really do their, after they see me, to maybe do some research, and really
Hmm.
like put some of the pieces together. Um, so and that, in terms of interesting, that I wasn't expecting that. Like that was like, okay, that's
Yeah.
cool.
I mean, is it possible that someone has these experiences and then overlays or interprets it as Lemuria or Atlantis or
Right.
something or something along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, I would say if you're into that stuff, all the time and know those vernaculars, I'd be a little bit more skeptical. But like, these clients, at least that I saw, they weren't like into that. It wasn't like their thing. So that to me led me on, that was more possible. I can't,
Mm.
like totally validate it, nor yeah, I don't know if I could ever, but it was just kind of interesting.
Yeah.
I think if someone came into me with like, wearing patchouli oil with a mountain T-shirt and all that kind of stuff, and not to knock, I do that stuff myself. Like you'd be like, all right, this person's already into this stuff. Maybe they're just kind of fantasizing and or just kind of
Hmm.
like experiencing, what they really connect to, but not going beyond, their conscious mind,
Yeah, I mean, because there are people who have said, "Oh, I had a past life. I was in Atlantis, or Mu, or Lemuria,"
Right,
and Atlantis, I think, is much more believable because I think
right,
there's an extraordinarily good amount of evidence to suggest that there was
sure,
kind of a pre-civilization
yeah,
civilization. I mean, if we're going to go back to like the youngest Dryar period and 10,000 plus years ago,
mhm,
um, uh, and that evidence is accumulative
mm,
to where we are now compared to like just 10, 20 years ago.
right,
So if someone said, "Oh, I think it was Atlantis," well, maybe it wasn't actually called Atlantis, but they're
mm.
just using that
Using
name because
that
that
term, yeah,
not
yeah,
unlike in the whole ancient astronaut theory, right? So people in the past saw these weird things in the sky and they just applied to it the vernacular that they knew, which was
right,
angels or messengers from God or
mm.
what have you. And so we might be actually seeing the same phenomena here. I wonder. Um, so when someone says Lemuria, they just don't know what they're actually looking at.
Right. It could be, but also, I mean, people have a phenomenon, and I believe it's called xenoglossy, where they use a language that they're not even familiar with, in this
Mm-hmm.
body, and they just kind of talk like another language when they're, connecting to past lives and stuff like that. I personally haven't seen that like bits and pieces, but not like extensive. But
Mm-hmm.
that to me is profound, where they're and it's not like when it's like it's one thing if it's like gibberish, but like you're actually able to like it's like, a real language that's translatable. That's pretty profound. It does happen, you
Oh
know.
yeah. Do you think that when we have those cases where someone gets into an accident or something happens and then they suddenly know how to play an instrument, or
Right.
they're like near genius level
Oh yeah.
at math or what have you, do you think that that is the, an accidental like kind of tapping into what some might call the akashic record?
Mm. It's interesting. I mean, I've firsthand seen near-death experiencers, at different seminars that I've been to who had no prior training or experience with piano, and they're just able to not only play the piano, but play the piano in a way that describes the sounds that they were hearing on the other side, and it's
Mm,
almost kind of like a channeled, performance, and it's profound. So it's hard to say if it's like channeled stuff
mhm.
or if they had this TBI that really changes, this part of their brain that's all of a sudden able to have this savant kind of elements to themselves, where that artistic component within, their brain or
Mm,
whatever. So it could be either or both. It's interesting. But
yeah.
that in lies. I know you asked a question like there are so many gifts that come from these NDEs, but I mean, that's evident, but what's not spoken about is how difficult it is. Everyone seems to want these near-death experiences, but it,
Mhm.
it was a it was a difficult experience, at least for me, being as young as I was and as traumatic of an experience that I had. It's a double-edged sword. I still see it to this day. I wouldn't trade it for anything, but
Mm.
it's not something that I would wish on the average person. I'll leave it there.
Sure. Do you have a particular past life that you're familiar with that is kind of more prominent?
Yes, I mean, and I speak about this in both of my book, but I do believe that my near-death experience was very much related, to this last past life. Um, it's hard, because I know this is a very sensitive subject, but something that I deal with every day. And I think the more we're able to speak about it, the less stigma or ostracization or fear that we have about it. But, this is a lifetime in which, I don't say commit because, you don't commit cancer, you don't commit a heart attack, but I
Mhm.
had a death by suicide. And this is something that, I experienced not only NDE, but also had so many of these, memories within my childhood, in life. But I've had different intuitives that have come to me prior to me ever becoming public, describing exactly what happened, like, to the T, in different intuitive readings in my very early 20s where I didn't say a word. It happened to me on several occasions. So,
Hmm.
in that life, and not to get too much, because I know it's a very sensitive subject for a lot of listeners, but it's something that has universality at this point because we've all been impacted within our lives, or someone that we know pretty much who has struggled, or who has gone through this path. But I literally, in that last lifetime, I didn't see any possibility off of what circumstance that I was in. My back was against the wall, and I was just it felt identical to my NDE, and I, made that decision, but, I wasn't, condemned or anything like that.
Mm.
It was a tremendous healing that took place. But I think for myself in the world at large, I think I had my near death experience, as something with allegorical and translatable elements to people who might be going through, the dark night of the solar struggle, and the power of surrender to support, the power of surrender to
Mm.
something inside of you that's infinitely greater than the challenges that lie in front of you. And so for me, that's the reason why I'm living is I
Mm.
surrendered. I surrendered to the suffocation that I was experiencing. I surrendered, to this greater life, and that, you know, allowed me to survive my NDE. Had I held on to that, I don't know.
Yeah, and also from me, coming from my own experience, I think one thing that I found helpful, especially in the darkest of times, is not knowing. Oftentimes, people give up on life,
Mm,
for whatever number of reasons, and for me, not knowing
mm,
what it's all really about was
mm,
actually a reason to keep going, to
mm,
not give up. Because I think oftentimes we find ourselves in a place where it's like I don't know what's the point, like what's the point,
mm,
why I'm here. And I once I was like able to kind of flip that and think in terms of, well, that's the point, I don't know,
mm.
like, so why give up on something if I don't actually understand what I'm giving up on,
Right,
you know
right. I made a post earlier today about the great unknown and how, that is the biggest fear that people have is the unknown. And we
Mm,
could
mhm.
engage with that in multiple ways, but that really keeps us alive. Is just this unknown.
Yeah.
Each day, we are able to learn more things, but there's more unknowns, and that keeps us going. And to make friends with the great unknown, which is death,
Mhm.
will allow people to have more purpose and more meaning, in their everyday lives, where it's not something that is pushed away, but rather a part of our life that's embraced and we find meaning and purpose from. But it's our nature to hold on to what we know and to push away what we don't know. And people really get attached to the struggle instead of allowing themselves to open themselves up to different pathways, of viewing a circumstance or a situation or different alternatives to what you're currently going through that could transpire.
That's great. Jacob, if you can leave us with one thought, what would it be? Besides what you just left us with.
With one thought,
One
I
thought, one
I
comment, one quote, whatever you want. Yeah.
I would say, we could have a million people around us, we could still feel alone.
Mhm.
But I think what's important is people sometimes forget, how loved they are and how much support we have around us in this life and beyond. And I think what's important is for people to really start reframing how they view themselves. And sometimes the world has created our identities in our mind. And when you tap into the stuff, our minds could really create the worlds that we live in. And so I think if people are able to tap into something, bigger than how they see themselves in their own ego,
Mm.
they could find great beauty. Michelangelo would say, we all have a masterpiece. We just have to chip away of that which is already there.
Mhm.
He did a lot of other stuff that I don't agree with, but that's one of the things that I, I
Yeah.
definitely, I definitely agree with. That's a beautiful statement. Yeah.
Thank you, Jacob. I appreciate that, and I'll just add that that greater thing could be anything, and be careful
Right.
what that greater thing is too.
Great
You know,
power, great
that's
responsibility, right? So,
exactly, because that's how cults come about. But at the same time,
right.
there's certain forms of spirituality. I mean,
Mm,
in addiction recovery, people have the expression that the room, which is the group, is the higher power, right? And
mm,
so, you can. It doesn't have to be a god. It doesn't have to be, a particular sect of this or that.
mm,
There are many ways. Like for you, you seem to embrace Buddhism quite a bit too.
mm.
So there's a lot of open-ended ways of approaching that if you're not like the more religiously inclined. So I just want to put that out there as well.
Of course.
So
Many paths up to the mountain. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. All right. And if you want to find out more about Jacob, please check out his website, jacoblcooper.com. Jacob, thank you so much.
Thank you. An honor. And if anyone's interested, I have my books also, Life After Breath, The Wisdom Jacob's Ladder. Do take a look. They are fascinating reads from what I hear. So thank you.
from what we all hear. All
From
right,
what I
thanks,
hear.
Jacob.
Yeah. Yeah.
And thank you all for joining on another episode of Mystic Lounge on the Mystic Lounge YouTube channel. And if you want to check out our other podcast, Coffee and UFOs, please do so. Please subscribe, like, comment down below. Click the notification bell. It really helps to give you the alert when we drop a new episode or when we do a random live stream. Thank you all. Peace and love. And until next time, live in the mystery.